Well, hi everybody. Welcome to this very short presentation on team identity, which is a very interesting topic. And I'm assuming that a lot of you out there are already do have teams and are probably a little bit curious about the whole concept of team identity. So we want to create a team identity, but we want to create a positive team identity. Sometimes we can create an identity of a team that's too strong. In other words, the team insulates itself from the rest of the organization and its stakeholders. So we want to be able to do it in a way that's productive to the team, but also doesn't isolate us from the rest of the team. So we're going to cover a little bit of that today. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask me, go to the chat box and at any stage, just type in your question and I'll keep an eye on that. And as soon as I see something there, I will respond to it immediately. So welcome wherever you are. And I'll just share my screen and we'll get stuck into it. Okay, so you can see from this screen that I've got a book coming out very soon, in a matter of weeks actually, called Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And I'd love you to purchase a copy of that. In fact, I'll provide you with a little incentive to do that later on, in the session that we have with the 30 minutes we've got. So we'll look at the 3 characteristics of team identity. So let's just talk about what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to look at what team identity actually is. So it's very important to understand what it is, but also what it isn't, because I think when you mention the words team identity, it can have different meanings to different people. So we'll actually have a look at that. We'll look at the characteristics of team identity. And in fact, there are 3 characteristics that I'll share with you. And then we'll finish up talking about some strategies around how you might actually create a more robust team identity. And I'll finish up the session on that note. All right, so what is team identity? What do we actually mean by team identity? It actually refers to the extent to which the team members identify with the team. So, if you, for example, walked up to somebody, or you're at a barbecue, or you're at a party or something, and you ask somebody what they actually did, they might tell you what they have done, and then they might refer to the team or the function in their business that they're actually attached to. Or on the other hand, they might tell you what they do, and they might talk about the organization at large. So that gives you a little clue where they feel their identity is really vested. Is it in the organization, or is it in the team within the organization? So that's the first clue. So it's really the extent to which people actually identify with the team, that is your team. So if you have a compelling team identity, people will feel a sense of very much a sense of involvement with that team, and in that sense. So obviously, if you create a team identity that's so strong that people can only see past the barriers or can't see past the barriers around the team, then that's a problem, because obviously all teams don't work in isolation. They work with a range of different stakeholders, and they work with a range of internal and external. And if the team has too strong a team identity, then it obviously creates a little bit of a problem, because obviously people don't feel comfortable referring to the team or approaching the team. And of course, the team members don't feel it's their role to actually involve themselves in stakeholder management. So it's a balancing act between getting an identity that people are comfortable with, but not to the extent where it actually is a detriment and a blocker from other aspects of the organization. So that's what team identity is. What it isn't, it's not about team harmony. It's quite possible, for example, that a team can have a very strong team identity but not be very harmonious. And likewise, a team can be quite harmonious but not necessarily have a strong team identity. So it doesn't actually mean the same thing. So in terms of what the team identity consists of, there are basically 3 features of team identity that I've identified. And I'm going to spend a bit of time now just running through these features. And while I go through these features, I'd like you to have a think about your own team and think about how how strong each of these features are within your team. So you'll notice it's a fairly simple model, and there are three features. One is buffering, the other is bridging, and the third one is building. And this comes from good research, and I've changed the names in my book to just be a little bit more easier to remember. Buffering, bridging, and building all have a little ring to it. So let's have a look at each of these features and what they mean for the team and what it means for you as a leader leading that team. So let's start with buffering. So buffering basically it involves protecting the team from unwanted outside distractions. So it's now any team, of course, it doesn't work in isolation. Your team works with a whole range of other stakeholders within the organization and outside, depending on the size of your business, of course. But what a team leader does, if they're doing a good job in buffering, is making sure that some of the unnecessary, and the key word is unnecessary distractions from outside the team don't impede the team's progress. So, and I'll give some examples of that shortly. And of course, if a team leader doesn't make any effort to buffer the team, then obviously people from outside the team will cannibalize the team's resources, or they will interfere in ways that aren't necessarily productive to the team. So to some extent, the team leader has to protect the team from some of these outside elements that might cannibalize the team and some of its resources. Those resources could be human resources, people. It could be technical resources such as computers, or it could also be administrative resources, as in imposing certain bureaucracy on the team, which isn't actually helpful for the team. Now, of course, a lot of these things can't be buffered, and we have to accept the fact that the teams don't work in isolation, and they are part of a larger organization. However, if the team leader makes no effort to buffer, then it creates a problem for the team, because obviously their resources become cannibalized, as I mentioned. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of that, if I may. Now, you'll get a copy of these slides. You'll get a copy of this presentation as well at the end. So it looks a little bit wordy, but I'll just paraphrase some examples here. But I've given you some examples so that later on you can look at this and think, okay, do these things happen in my team? So, for example, if another team in your organization is short-staffed, there might be an imposition on your team that one of your team members be seconded to another team for a duration or a period of time. Now, whilst that would obviously benefit the other team, it may not necessarily benefit your team. And, you know, it's a judgment call, of course, as whether a team leader would do that. But if somebody just simply seconds somebody from your team because their team's short-staffed and that is detrimental to your team, then that might be an example where you as the team leader intervene and try and prevent that from happening. So that would be a human resource intervention. Another one might be that there's a project manager and you're working in a matrix organization. So you're basically a matrix organization is where you've essentially got two bosses. You've got your functional boss and you've also got your project-based boss. Now, if the project-based boss is requiring some of your team members to attend several meetings a week, which is quite intrusive to your own team, and you find out that those team meetings aren't actually helpful for anybody, in other words, they're a complete waste of time, then as a team leader, you might jump in and say, well, look, you know, that's not on. You know, as far as I'm concerned, this person's critically important to the team, and I'd ask that they not need to attend that meeting or those meetings in future. So that would be another example where there's an intrusion from outside where the team leader might have to jump in and do something about that. You've also got where you might be working in a bureaucratic organisation where there's lots and lots of forms to fill out and paperwork and boxes to tick. All of those things may take considerable amounts of time and take away the attention of your team members to complete all of this paperwork when they in fact aren't working on their core business. So that would be a administrative resource. Now, you may not be able to do anything about that, but you can at least question, why are we doing this? What's the value of actually completing this, paperwork or whatever it might be? So that would be an example of an administrative resource that's perhaps being, intruding into your team and what it does. And finally, a manager may feel that there's a spare computer in your area, and they decide that they're going to take that computer because they're short, or maybe they've just recruited a new team member. Now, you may well accept that, but then on the other hand, if that's going to be hugely inconvenient to your team, then buffering, an example of buffering would be where you would challenge whether or not that would be required. So you can see that buffering should go on a regular basis. Now, you can see that obviously you can do this to too much of an extent, and we've all seen team leaders do this. Where it becomes a problem, of course, is if you're buffering to the extent where you're not seeing yourself as part of the overall landscape of the organisation. Well, that would be problematic. But nevertheless, there's always a line to be drawn there. There's always, intrusions that are put on your team, and a team leader should challenge some of those intrusions. Now, bridging is a different concept. Now, bridging, in fact, is the exact opposite of that. Bridging is where your team and you, as the team leader, are reaching out to the important stakeholders in your organisation that help you achieve your success in your team. And of course, no team is working in isolation. And of course, good stakeholder management is critically important to any high-performing team. So this is the counterbalance between buffering. This is where you're reaching out and building good working relationships with key stakeholders in other departments, or perhaps even external to the organisation. Now, that's obviously really important because your team needs to rely on those resources. But again, you can spend a little bit too much time doing that as well. So buffering is protecting yourself from some of the outside distractions, and bridging, of course, is making sure that you are reaching out and building alliances with the key stakeholders in your team. Now, the third one is building. So you've got building, which is the third feature of team identity. Now, building, very similar to buffering, is an internal process. So building is around the idea of building a team culture that is productive. All teams have a culture. Regardless of what you might think, your team has a culture. And one of the things you might like to do in one of your team meetings, it's a fun exercise and it'll be very insightful. But if you ask your team members, say in one of your team meetings, if you had to describe our team as a colour, what colour would it be and why? If you had to describe our team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? And if you had to describe our team as a motor vehicle, what motor vehicle would it be and why? This is a very insightful exercise because what you'll find is, of course, the colour and the animal and the vehicle will be different for each person, but you'll find some common themes running through in terms of the why. And so what you're trying to do at this point is create a culture that is working for you. So what you want to do, of course, is have a productive culture in your team, or a subculture, if you like. Of course, your team's part of a larger organisation, but there's also a team culture as well. And by asking those three questions, you can get a very good handle on what other people perceive to be the culture of the team. You then might like to ask the team, if you had to describe our team as a colour in its ideal circumstance, what would it be? What would be the animal and what would be the vehicle? In other words, where are we now and where do we need to go? And that can be a very useful exercise for you to start building your team culture to make it more productive. and take the team with you, in other words, and not just be left to yourself. So it's an important one. So we've got buffering, which is stopping the distractions from outside the team impacting and interfering with your core business. We've got bridging, which is around reaching out to the key stakeholders who are critically important to resource your team. And of course, we've got building, which is around creating a robust culture within the team. So basically, your role as a team leader, if you're really looking at building a great identity in your team, is to look after buffering, bridging, and building. And by doing those three things, you're creating a team identity. And you're creating a productive team identity, provided, of course, you don't go too far with any of these three features. So there are some ways of actually doing that that become quite important, and I'll get to that in a moment. And I just want to check to see if there are any questions that people have got. You can either go to the Q&A box, or you can go to the chat box and just type in your question, and I'll get to see that, and I'll certainly answer it the moment I see something come up on the screen. So buffering, bridging, and building. Now, the strategies involved. Now, you'll notice on your screen that we've got the three features in the model of team identity in the middle. So you've got team identity, and then you've got buffering, bridging, and building. And now what you've got is you've got some strategies around the outside. And those strategies are also, from my own investigations and observations and working across 21 industries, there are 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. So if you showed me a high-performing team anywhere, in the world of sport, in business, arts, politics, anywhere at all, what I would probably find is that these 8 characteristics are deeply embedded within the team. But these characteristics are also critically important to be able to give expression to those three features I talked around buffering, bridging, and building. So I want to spend a bit of time just running through those with you. And obviously I go through these in great detail in my book. But if we start at buffering, you'll notice that there are 3 key characteristics or strategies that are important in terms of buffering. So building trust. Now, you show me any high-performing team anywhere, and I'll show you a team that's got a fairly healthy level of trust in its team. And of course, trust, unfortunately, is an elusive concept. It can fluctuate depending on what's going on at the time. It can also vary within the team. So, for example, you may trust one person, but not another. And so it's one of those elusive concepts. The other thing about trust, of course, as we all know, it's very easy to lose trust. Someone violates your trust, it's very easy to lose trust or mistrust that person as a result of it. But on the other hand, it's very hard to get trust. So it takes a long time. And it's one of those things where you never arrive. But if there's a strong level of trust in your team, then it's likely that the outside influences that are trying to create a problem for your team are not likely to be as effective as they might otherwise be, because your team bands together to prevent those external intrusions. Shared leadership is also an important characteristic, and I'm just going to go clockwise around the model. Shared leadership is about the process where you share the baton of leadership so that you don't just make all the decisions yourself as a team leader, and that there are certain times and places where you want your team completely engaged in the leadership of the team. And one of the things that I'd suggest you do is in your team meetings, for example, I'd reduce the amount of reporting and try to create some time to have a team discussion about a variety of different issues. And by doing that, you are sharing the leadership, and that's the simplest way of doing that. So, for example, I mentioned before the 3 questions: what color, what animal, and what vehicle. That would be something where you could share the leadership around the culture of the team. Or you could just simply ask the team on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think the level of trust is in the team? And then perhaps ask people to explain why, without necessarily mentioning names or pointing fingers of blame or whatever. Those things are sharing the baton of leadership around team culture. Now, the third characteristic around buffering that's critically important is being agile. Now, you know, agile is a fairly trendy word, but whether we like it or not, agile is the new black. I mean, the truth is we've all got to be agile. And if COVID-19 hasn't taught us anything, it is that we need to be quite agile. We need to be flexible, maneuverable. We need to be able to chop and change readily and quickly. So if your team have those potential attributes, then it's likely, of course, that you won't be necessarily distracted from outside influences, because what it means is that you can chop and change when you need to. You can move from one thing to the next very, very readily. So building trust, sharing leadership, and being agile are three ways that you can buffer your team from some of the outside influences that are going to distract your team from the main game. So that's buffering. Now, if we move now on to bridging, you'll notice that there are only two characteristics there, albeit they're very, very important. One of those is creating purpose. So all high-performing teams have a very, very clear understanding of what their primary purpose is. And one of the exercises you might like to do with your team is to actually ask your team what its purpose is. And that's an interesting question, and that you'll find will raise some very interesting responses in your team. And you don't want a long-winded explanation. You want people to be able to mention that in one simple sentence. Try it out, see what happens. But if a team's got a very clear purpose of what it does, then it's likely that it will know when, where, and how to reach out to the key stakeholders it requires in order to resource its team. And of course, the stakeholders will be happy with that too, because if a team's got a clear purpose, it's likely that the team will basically contribute or share that purpose with the stakeholders, which is good for the stakeholders as well as the team. I've got a colleague in the United States who believes that everything we do in teams, in fact, he argues that 40% of everything we do is what we might refer to as fake work. We've all heard of fake news. Fake work is work that's not necessarily directly or indirectly linked to the strategic direction of the organization or the team. So that's a lot. So, you know, if your team aren't clear about its purpose, then it's obviously likely that people will be getting involved in busyness instead of actually creating, you know, useful results. Now, the other aspect of bridging, of course, is to manage your stakeholders. And one of the things that I strongly recommend that you do is you actually create a stakeholder map. Now, a stakeholder map is to work with your team and work out who are all the stakeholders you rely on in order for you to do what you need to do. And you'll find that if you persevere with that, you'll find that there's quite a list of stakeholders. There'll be stakeholders, stakeholders can be defined as anything from your boss, who you must rely on in order to you know, increase budgets or a range of things, right through to maybe a government agency that you need to conform to once a year or whatever. So once you've listed all your stakeholders on this map, you can then ask them and say, well, which of these are the 5 key stakeholders? Which are the most important stakeholders that we deal with in order for us to do our job? You circle those if you're writing them on a whiteboard, and then you talk to your team about what we can do. What can we do in order to improve our management of our stakeholders, particularly the top 5, because we've identified them as critically important to our team output. So by doing that, by creating purpose and managing stakeholders, you are bridging, which is the second feature of team identity. Now, the third feature of team identity, of course, is building. Now, building, as I said, is an internal function where you're creating a strong team culture. And there are 3 characteristics there. So let me run through those 3 with you. One is improving systems. All high-performing teams are in a continuous state of improvement. and they're always looking at how they can do things better, faster, safer, easier. They're always looking at those things. But unfortunately, many of us in the corporate world, or in the business world in general, we don't have the time, and we only deal with system improvements when the system is broken down. So what we've got to do is we've got to try and create the time and space to be allowed to do that. A lot of people say, well, where do I start? The place to start with improving your systems is your big ticket items. What are the key things that your team does on a regular basis? So is it producing reports? Is it teaching? What is it that your team does more than anything else? That's the place to start, because if you can get a 10% improvement on the big ticket items that your team does, then you're going to make a significant difference to improving the systems in your team. But you need to create the space and the time to do that, because it's not likely. And of course, the other side of it is that a lot of your team members may well think that it's your responsibility to do that, but in actual fact, it's everybody's responsibility to do that. And by engaging people in shared learning, around shared leadership around this, you can start to look at how your systems can be done better, faster, easier, and so forth. Now, just before we wrap up, we've got utilising diversity, and don't think of diversity just as about gender or ethnicity. Diversity is also about thinking styles. Each person in your team has a unique way of looking at problems, and trying to be able to capitalise on that is critically important. So, and there's plenty of tools out there to help you. I personally use team management profiles, but other people may use other systems. And all high-performing teams learn continuously. They never stop learning. And so creating a culture of continuous improvement in your team is critically important. So if you create a culture of continuous improvement, utilize the diversity in your team, and improve your systems, then it's likely that you are attending to the building feature of team identity. Okay, so let's now move to my final point here. Quick plug, if I may. My book's going to be out in a matter of weeks, Winning Teams, and I've got an offer for you today. If you pre-order a copy of my book, and you can do that, it's just $30 plus postage. I will send you a link to an online course on building highly effective teams, and in that course we go into a whole lot of these 8 strategies in more detail, giving you strategies and ways and means of improving your own team identity. So that's valued at $675, so it's a really good deal. All you've got to do in order to take advantage of that is to send me an email by the close of business today, and there's my email there. If you do that, I'll send you a link, and you can start working on these things immediately, and in a couple of weeks' time, I will sign the book and send it to your postal address. So hopefully you can take advantage of that. So folks, that's it from me. I will just sign out at this stage, and I just wanted to thank each of you for being involved in this presentation. If you've got other questions you want to ask, you know where to get me, but take advantage of that offer. It's a one-off offer, and you'll receive a copy of the slides and recording sometime this afternoon. So it won't be too far away, and you can have a bit more of a look at some of those 8 characteristics and those 3 features of team identity. So thanks, folks. All the very best, and we look forward to hearing from you. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we can catch up at some point. Thank you and goodbye.